I'd like to start, if I can, by asking everybody who listens to podcasts if they can raise their hands. I have massively lost that bit already. I've recently been introduced to them, and I've absolutely find them fascinating. They are the best thing. It's like having the best radio in your pocket to listen to anytime you like. But I have become obsessed. And I've become obsessed with Malcolm Gladwell's revisionist history. If you don't know this, this is a historian that looks at events in history that have been misunderstood or overlooked. And one of Malcolm's episodes is called The Burden of Proof, which is a timely thing to talk about today. In this episode, he asks this question: what level of proof do we need about the harmfulness of something before we act? And that got me thinking about this presentation. Because over 25 years, there's been more, in excess of 100 studies on the indoor environment. And each one of these studies tells us that the indoor environment affects us in certain ways. Now, I did have a slide with lots of studies on it. This doesn't seem to work. But it looked awful, so I've got just 4 for you to look up. This is Fisk, 2000, Health and Productivity Gains from the Indoor Environment. Sepinen and Fisk, Quantitative Relations between the Indoor Environment. Osland, who you may recognise the name, but you'll definitely recognise the picture. He's not done that move yet. And our performance, which was Whole Life Performance Plus, which was a 2-year study with consortium members. So, you'd be thinking that with all those studies, as I said, they're just 4 of those studies, you'd think that with all that evidence, all that proof, that the indoor environment would be something that's already mainstream. It should be something that we're all monitoring, measuring, and acting upon, but it isn't. At least it isn't yet. I don't think so anyway. So what level of proof do we need before we act? We've already got lots of it. Now, I did a bit of research and I discovered this, which is the burden of proof scale. So the burden of proof is used to put evidence against this scale. Obviously, you've got believe not at the bottom, all the way up to beyond all reasonable doubt at the top. And I thought, would it be interesting if we put this question against that scale? So that's what I'm going to do today. Our question for the day is, does the internal environment affect performance and productivity? So if we put this on this scale, and this is a predetermined slide, but where would it be today? And I think it's round about there. I don't think that we could argue it's going to be any higher than that. Might be a bit higher, but with the data that we've got, the fact that it's not mainstream, it's somewhere around about there. Now, my aim is that at the end of this presentation, you'll all join me as members of the jury, and we'll see if we can push that level up. Okay. So the study was done. It was a consortium of companies that came together, and it was called Whole Life Performance Plus. It was led by LCMB, with academics at Oxford Brookes University doing all the data crunching and the peer-reviewed reports. And there were case study partners, Argent, Emcor UK, and King's College London. Now, it was funded by Innovate UK and the EPSRC. I always get that wrong, EPSRC. It was quite a high fund, 530,000, and its main focus was to provide empirically validate the link between the indoor environment and productivity. So proper evidence-based management, evidence-based understanding. Now, it did that in 3 ways. We did a study of the environment, the indoor environment. We looked at temperature, humidity, and CO2. And at the same time, we were looking at the outside environment in terms of temperature and humidity to balance between the two to understand what's going on inside and outside. We did, like everybody else has done today, we did perceived productivity tests. So this was Basically, occupant feedback, it was an online survey. I think that app would have been fantastic if we'd had access to that. But it was an online survey and 5,662 responses. And then we measured productivity. So again, this was same occupants, Stroop tests, numerical tests, proofreading tests, all that stuff. Over 2,000 respondents. Now, the unique bit with our study is that it was in real-life buildings. And as I said, we had case study partners. This was the King's College London building. It's the JCMB building in Waterloo. 10,000 square meters, 1,200 occupants. It's an old building. It was constructed in 1938, mixed mode of ventilation and in-house FM. And then Emcor UK, very lucky to have the National Air Traffic Services as a customer of ours. NATS immediately saw the benefit of the study and offered up the building that you see there. It's their corporate and technical centre, nothing to do with air traffic controllers. Corporate and technical centre in the leafy suburbs of Fareham in Hampshire. So two very similar sized buildings. In the field, the approach was that we did an intervention. So we did a baseline period, baseline before intervention. We baselined the buildings in a 7-month period in which we monitored again the internal environment of those buildings and the external environment in those locations, whilst asking the occupants questions. That was it, 7 months. We did 3 weeks of surveys. And then we did an intervention stage where 10 months, and then we tweaked the environment as best we could. So obviously both those buildings very different, quite difficult to alter the environment, but we did make some significant changes to it. And then we resurveyed everybody throughout that period to see what effects altering the environment had. So just run through the buildings because I think they're quite interesting from a start point. The two buildings, as I said, very different. JCMB, in terms of temperature, reached a scorching 30 degrees in the summer and an absolutely freezing 16 degrees in the winter, so huge range. Whereas NATS, it's mechanically ventilated, it has air conditioning. It was just a fairly constant 22 to 26. In terms of relative humidity, so there is a standard, I don't know if you know, there's a guideline that says that relative humidity should be above 40%, should be between 40 and 70%. Both the buildings were below 40% for quite a lot of time. Interestingly, the NATS building was below 40% for the longest period of time. And obviously that's because it has air conditioning, but the ramifications of that is colds and flus can actually travel much easier in low humidity environments. So although we couldn't test for this in terms of a productivity score, it's something that we needed to be aware of. And CO2 levels is the thing. So CO2 levels across these buildings varied widely. Now, JCMB building, it is, as I said, it's a traditional building. It has windows that open. It has wet system radiators. So as you can see on that graph, it peaked at 2,000, well over 2,000 parts per million. Now that's in the heating season. So windows are closed, heating's on, bad ventilation, CO2 rises, and there's nothing that they can really do about that. Whereas the NATS building peaked at 1,500 parts per million, but most of the time was around 12 to 1,400, and again, that's because of its ventilation advantages. So, what did we learn? Well, I'm going to go through 3 things. Comfort, temperature, and finally the CO2. So, we learned that if you feel uncomfortable, you believe you're less productive. Now, this isn't about providing people more cushions and soft furnishings, although as a workplace consultant that does help. But if you feel that your temperature variances are not being met, then you report a lower level of productivity. Now, this is shown in this graph. So we have self-reported productivity on the left and comfort on a scale of 1 to 7 across the bottom. Now, you'll see that the more comfortable people are reporting themselves, the higher the productivity is. Interestingly, this works for thermal sensation as well. So if you're too cool or too hot, as seen on that graph, your productivity can dive on either end of that scale. So what does this mean? I mean, this essentially means that our willingness, let me just go back actually, I need to explain this. There's 2 lines on that graph. There's the green line JCMB and the blue line NATS. Now, if you remember that the JCMB building had a wide variance of temperature, 30 to 16, and NATS was much less, you'd think that this would bear a resemblance in this graph, that the JCMB building would be saying that they are less comfortable and therefore less productive. But interestingly, the trend followed very similar lines. In fact, the JCMB building, as you can see, reported slightly higher numbers. And this is because it seems that our willingness to accept certain conditions is based on our experience and expectations, which I think can be described by, I think is probably the most British of equations. Happiness is reality minus expectations. And this isn't a guide or a goal, by the way. We shouldn't be kind of saying everybody has low expectations, let's give them bad places to work. We should be looking at that. But it seems that if you're waking up in the morning and it's a really hot, sunny summer's day, and you're already hot and you're going to work and you're expecting to be hot at work, or cold if it's winter, then your expectations when you get there are met. I mean, you're not probably happy about it, but you're not unhappy about it. And comparing that to the NATS building, if your expectations are to be in a tightly controlled environment, and you get there and things aren't quite right, then you are very definitely unhappy about it. And during the intervention stages, we actually saw that within half a degree, people in the NATS building would be calling up the help desk to say that they're either too hot or too cold. Whereas obviously the occupants of the JCMB building, they don't have the luxury of being able to control it other than opening a window or closing the window. So they just kind of accept it and get on with it, really. So as I said earlier, that was perceived productivity. And I think the presentation before kind of alluded to the fact that perceived productivity does also link quite closely to actual productivity. And our study bore the same result. So again, we've got all of the tasks, proofreading, numerical testing, Stroop testing on the left-hand side there, and temperature. And we discovered that the hotter the office got, the lower the test scores became. We couldn't do it the other way around because people don't really like to be cold. And we found that quite a difficult thing. So by the time we got to that point, a lot of surveys had been completed, and we were worried about suffering from survey overload. But I think it's really interesting that shows this case, that the hotter you are and the more uncomfortable you are, the less your scores actually resulted in. But for us, and for the most of this study, the real interesting thing is CO2, because CO2 is the least measured environmental condition. And I say least now, not never measured, because I was presenting this to a customer the other week and trying to explain to them about CO2, and I said, no one measured CO2, which was a really stupid thing to say, because the client sat back in his chair and said, Ian, if you look at that white box over there, we're measuring CO2 in this meeting room right now, which made me feel a little bit silly. But I went over and I looked at that white box and read the number, came back, sat back down again, and said, oh, it's 560 parts per million. And he sat there and eventually went, is that good? So I reclaimed that. I said, yes, aha. Isn't it interesting that you're measuring something and you have no idea what it means? So, and it is good. For any 560 parts per million is about 500 lower than the guidelines. So it is a good score. But consider this as well. We were in a meeting room. There was only 5 of us in that meeting room. But how many meeting rooms or how many meetings do you go to where there's 10, 15, 20 people? And you're sat there for 2-3 hours maybe. Most of the decisions you make in a meeting are usually at the end when you discuss and vote on what's going to happen. Now, you've been in that meeting room for that period of time, and you, if you're not measuring it, have no idea whether the CO2 levels are rising or not. But your brain does. Your brain will notice it, and you'll start to feel tired. You'll start maybe thinking that the air is a bit stuffy. Maybe you'll be thinking about what you're having for dinner later on. And the point is that unless you measure it, it's something that you're never going to understand whether it's affecting you or not. And when we're in that situation, what do we do? Because at the moment, the only thing you can do is have a cup of coffee. And there isn't any proven link between coffee and CO2, as much as I'd like Cafe Nero to sponsor us to do that, which I'm going to try to do, the coffee of choice. But there is no proven link. So the only thing we can do is that. But it absolutely is the thing that affects us the most, above all the other conditions. And this, again, was our results, all the tests, proofreading, numerical Stroop tests. On the left-hand side, all the scores, CO2 concentration, anything under 1200, and we were seeing results of 12% improvement under 1200 parts per million of CO2. Going back to the JCMB building, and not just them, I don't want to pick on them. We've got some sensors in other buildings, and we know that even open plan offices can result in CO2 concentrations above 2,000, which is quite phenomenal, really. So yeah, so there is a definite link with productivity and CO2. Now, on the bottom left of this graph, you'll see 700 parts per million. Now, that's probably the lowest that we're going to get in a building, but it's interesting that atmospheric CO2 that I checked yesterday, atmospheric CO2 is 412 parts per million. Now, back in 1957, when they started recording atmospheric CO2, it was 316 parts per million. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? So when we say that we need to have mechanical ventilation and we need to bring fresh air into our office buildings, it's not the same fresh air as it was 50 years ago. And I think that the concern is, and something that we can all need to look at, is that if we're aiming to drive down CO2, what level are we trying to get it down to? Because CIBSE guidelines says 1,000 parts per million. If you want a well building standard, it's 800 parts per million. Anything that we've seen above 1,200 affects your performance. So if you're going to spend energy driving down the internal space's CO2, technically creating more CO2 in the atmosphere because you're using energy to drive that down, it's going to be a bit of a circular motion. So I think we need to have a bit more understanding about what level we're trying to get that down to and who needs to be in environments where it is at its lowest. So I'm going to try to win the understated comment of the day award here. Breathing is important. I think I've won. We take 16 breaths a minute, 960 breaths an hour, and 23,000 breaths in a day, average. Now, interestingly, or I found it interesting anyway, the volume of an average breath is about the same size as a mineral water bottle, 500 millilitres. That's 500 millilitres in, and if you're lucky, 500 millilitres back out again. If you captured all of those external outgoing breaths, by September, you would have breathed out enough to fill a hot air balloon. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You know someone that might do that in a day. Maybe even someone might manage that this afternoon. But it's something that we take for granted. And it's something that, from a perspective of CO2, it's obviously very important. And it strikes me that when we go into buildings, and buildings that we don't have any control over the environment of, we kind of hand over that responsibility to the people that manage that space. And unless the people that manage that space measure that environment, whatever that environment of that building is, it's about to be inside you. Because I think it was the last Workplace Trends conference when a statistic was suggested that 80% of UK office workers spend less than an hour a day outside. And I was kind of shocked when I saw that. And then I totted up what my life is like, and I am exactly that person. Despite I consider myself quite outdoorsy, but I easily spend less than an hour a day outside. Easily. So, as I said, breathing is important. So let's recap. These are our insights of our study. Occupant perception of the indoor environment matters. The task performance is affected by indoor environmental conditions. All of them, mostly CO2. And like the other studies, perceived productivity can closely match actual productivity. So it's a good metric and it's a good way of finding out what's going on in your space. The findings are 12% higher scores on proofreading tests below CO2 levels of 1400. Numerical tests, the CO2 needed to be a little bit lower, but 12% when the CO2 was lower than 1,000 parts per million. And on one of the studies that we did, the study group was actually 38% quicker at performing the task when the CO2 was below 1,000. So, what level of proof do we need about the harmfulness of something before we act? Again, 100 studies. This was over 2 years, so it's a lot of data. If we can go back to our burden of proof scale and again ask this question, does the internal environment affect performance and productivity? Now, it's a predetermined slide, but I hope that you all agree with me when I press the button and we go, how far? Yeah, well, we can't go any lower than that because otherwise it's no proof, right? So it's proof. We've got to say that it's up there. So what's next? Well, I think that what's next is we need to increase our monitoring of the space. We've got the technology to do it now. Traditionally, we'd do this in a return air sensor and a BMS system, but we've got IoT, and we can put sensors all over the workplace, gather as much data as we need, so it's something that we should be doing. Obviously, back to my customer, I think you need to understand the measurements that you're getting. It's very important. There is no point measuring something unless you're going to do something with it or understand it. And I think that we need to bring it into the mainstream so that everybody can benefit from these results. Thank you for listening.